Première séance en direct depuis le début de la pandémie de recherche en lumière à l'école de musique Schulich. C'est un véritable plaisir de pouvoir reprendre cette série et de vous avoir parmi nous en personne. Nous sommes dans notre 7e saison et les présentations annulées plus tôt cette saison seront reprises dans la 8e saison. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first live session since the beginning of the pandemic of Research Alive at the Schulich School of Music. It's truly a pleasure to be able to start this series up again and to have you all with us in person. We're currently in our 7th season, and the presentations that were canceled earlier this year because of the pandemic, it's been 2 years now, almost to the day, I think, will be reprogrammed in the 8th season. My name is Stephen McAdams, and I co-curated this series with Kit Soden, who's sitting up there in the back. With this series, we aim to bring alive the humanistic, scientific, and engineering research in music, as well as the research that goes on behind the scenes in both performance and composition, and we'll hear some more about composition tonight. Today's session will be presented by the first prize winner of our yearly Research Alive Student Prize competition. This prize is generously funded by Jill de Villafranca and Dr. David Kustik, and I believe they're both here with us today, and we thank you greatly for your support of this whole thing. The first prize winner this year is musical and visual artist Chelsea Comschles, who you'll meet in a moment. We still have a presentation next week by the second prize winner, Tong Wang, with the third place finalist will be in the Nora Saint-Simois will be presented on the March 25th in the graduate colloquium of the Music Research Department. And you can find the links for these other events in the Schulich School of Music events calendar. We're already preparing the 8th season, so check back in the fall for some exciting new presentations of research in music scholarship and practice. The title of Chelsea's talk this evening is Crossmodal Correspondences in Composing and Listening to Music. Chelsea is a doctoral student in composition and has been awarded the Andrew Svoboda Prize in Orchestral Composition for a piece that will be performed by the McGill Symphony Orchestra next year. So join me in welcoming Chelsea Comschles and her organist colleague, Clara Gerdes.
All right, thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you all for being here. So you see this term on the screen, right? Cross-modal correspondences. How many of you have never heard of this before? This is a completely new concept to you. Okay, a few, yeah, good. So we're going to be defining what is a cross-modal correspondence in a few minutes. We're going to get there. First, I'm going to begin this talk in a place that maybe feels a little bit more familiar. We're going to be talking about musical meaning and the way that we kind of intuitively describe music. And then we're going to do a little audience participation activity that's kind of going to show you what a cross-modal correspondence is before I tell you. Then we'll get deep into the science. And then we'll go into some musical examples that exhibit cross-modal correspondences as connected to that science. And then finally, we'll talk about some applications in what we can do with these things in concerts. So this idea of musical meaning. When we are trying to describe music in terms of our own immediate subjective impressions, we often reach for cross-modal metaphor. So things like we call the music glassy or smooth, and we call it dark or thick or heavy or jagged or, large or small. All of these things are cross-modal metaphors. And you may think that these sorts of things must be entirely subjective, like they must be yours alone, or at least culturally learned. But what if these sorts of metaphors had a scientific basis? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So cross-modal metaphor about music has been described a particular concept, an abstract yet structured idea anchored to and allowing one to make sense of a perceptual representation. That's a quote by Sadis and Weinzierl, who are researchers in timbre semantics. So we're going to start with this example called the Buba-Kiki effect. Okay, one of these shapes is named Buba, and the other one is named Kiki. Okay, Booba and Kiki. So, what is the name of the shape? Let's say it on the count of 3, on the left here. On the count of 3, what is the shape? 1, 2, 3. Kiki. Yeah, right? That was easy. Everyone kind of intuitively got that answer. So this effect has been studied in a number of different experiments, but sometimes upwards of 95, even 98% of people say that the more spiky looking shape is named Kiki and the rounded shape is named Booba. And you might be thinking, well, wait a second, isn't it just because, you know, that one kind of is the same shape as a K and this one is the same shape as a B? But this effect has been found in numbers of different populations from different cultures with different types of written languages, and even in the Himba tribe in Namibia, who live traditionally and have had very little contact with the industrialized world and have no written language. So implying that both the shapes and our letters, K and B and maybe others, simply look like this sound. So now we're going to do, I call it a quiz. It's an audience participation activity. And for those who are watching on YouTube at home, you can put your answers into the chat, okay? So just using your intuition. Here's a sound. Which shape matches that sound? How many, can you raise your hand? How many think it's A? Oh, wow. Well, that's about everybody. Interesting. Okay, next one. This sound. Right? Which one matches that sound? How many people think it's A? Nobody. How many people think it's B? Okay, there we go. Everybody raise their hand. All right. Now I want you to imagine the experience of biting into a fresh lemon. Okay, you got it? Does that sound more like A? Or does it feel more like B? Okay, how many think A? Nobody? How many think B? Okay, everybody. Yeah. All right, here's a sound. Which color looks more like that sound? How many people think A? Okay, again, everybody's raising their hand. Okay, now can you imagine the experience of drinking warm or hot coffee? Or maybe maybe a black tea or something if you're not a coffee drinker. All right? Now, does that feel more like A? Or more like B? Okay, if it's good coffee, I hear. Okay, how many people think it's A? Okay, how many people think it's B? All right, look at this. Okay, and then I think we have one more. Can you imagine the taste of something salty? Okay. Is that A? Or B? Okay, how many for A? Nobody. How many for B? Okay, so you're kind of seeing what I'm getting at here. What you are experiencing are called cross-modal correspondences. So these are intuitive and often unexpected connections made between the sensory modes by most people and by even some animals. And these sorts of metaphors, like temperature, luminance, shape, and color, and texture, and these sorts of things are the kinds of things that come into play when we're talking about cross-modal metaphors in music. Okay, so here's the plan for the talk. First, we're going to be talking about the science of cross-modal correspondences, and we're going to be giving musical examples that relate to that science. And this is in 3 parts. The first part, we're going to be talking about color and visual correspondences. And we have examples from Debussy and Saariaho that will be illustrating that science. Next, we'll be talking about taste and smell, and we have a piece by Will Stackpole called Palette that will be illustrating those. And finally, we'll talk about temperature, and specifically cold temperature, and a piece by myself called Flow Edge that evokes that sort of cold temperature. Okay, and then the applications of this science. So I call it cross-modal concerts of the future. So we're going to be looking at first why the brain prefers things that match cross-modally. We'll get into a little bit more science. And then I'm going to be talking about a project called Symphony XR that I collaborated with Clara on, in which we put visuals made by game design students, so video game designers, to this organ piece that you're going to hear later. And then finally, we'll end with this organ piece, To Starboard, Starbound. And you'll hear it live on the organ today. Okay, so cross-modal correspondences, the science. We're going to talk about sound-color correspondences first. So we'll talk about these 4 categories: pitch, luminance, and saturation, yellowness, which is a special color that shows up in the literature, and finally, emotionally mediated colors. So beginning with pitch, luminance. So it's been shown in a number of different studies. This is one of the oldest correspondences that we know of, the earliest to be studied, already before the turn of the 20th century. So we'll talk about 3 examples. So this study by Marx, participants basically unanimously chose a spectrum from dark to light color. So on the x-axis we have dark color at the left and bright color at the right, and then we have low pitch on the bottom of the y-axis, high pitch at the top of the y-axis. So dark with low pitch, high pitch with bright color. Another experiment by Wicker has the same sort of spectrum. There's a lot of information on your screen, but I want you to focus on the x-axis right in the middle. So from the left, we have low pitch, to the right, high pitch. So all the colors that were chosen follow this low to high spectrum. And I'll also talk a little bit more about this. We don't have to worry about what all these different axes mean, but I do want to show how interesting it is. So the reason you see 2 of every color is that the experiment was repeated twice. So participants came back on a completely different day, and they redid the experiment. And the sounds that they were hearing were just very simple pitches. That's all it was. And they were asked to match them to colors. And they were so consistent that the second time the experiment was run, that the colors basically occupied the same location on this chart. It shows how consistent they were and how non-arbitrary that even simple pitches can be matched to colors. And finally, this is one of my favorites. This study by Ludwig and others in 2011 asked both humans and chimpanzees to do the same task. So they were instructed to choose one of 2 squares. So the instruction was either choose the black square or choose the white square. That's it. And they just have to do it as fast as they can. So if they're instructed to choose the white square, as fast as they can. But there was also a pitch, a sound that was played while they were doing the experiment that had nothing to do with the experiment. It just happened to be played while they were supposed to pick it. And when that sound was high and they were supposed to pick the white square, they performed much quicker, much more accurately. And when the pitch didn't match, so maybe they were supposed to pick the white square, but it was a low pitch that was sounded, the human participants were much slower in a statistically significant way. They were slower in picking, but they didn't actually pick the wrong square. But the chimpanzees actually performed worse. They chose the wrong color, so they'd hear a low pitch, and they were supposed to choose the white square, but they chose the black square, again, in a statistically significant way, which this and other studies have led researchers to think that this particular correspondence between pitch and luminance is so ingrained and so old that it's just part of our neural hardwiring. So when these things are used in music, it's like it's hard-coded in to us, and therefore the music. So that concludes the pitch luminance correspondence. Next, we're going to be talking about saturation. So we're talking about color saturation here. And color saturation refers to the vibrancy of the colors. So over here at the right, we have very saturated red, and at the left, we have very desaturated red. And this is related to a sound concept that I have to define called spectral centroid. And the spectral centroid is the center of gravity of a sound's partials. It'll be easier to hear it than to just have it explained to you. So a low spectral centroid is a sound that we often call very pure, maybe very plain, very calm, perhaps. So those sounds' energy are concentrated low down, like close to its fundamental pitch. Whereas the high spectral centroid is a sound that we call bright, ironically or not, and maybe even rough and nasal, those sorts of terms. Okay, do you hear the difference? So those are all the same pitch, fundamental pitch, but they were different brightnesses. So high spectral centroid means brighter sound. But what they found is that it doesn't just mean brighter sound, it also relates to brighter colors in these experiments. So this is an experiment by Hamilton Fletcher and others that they asked participants to match colors. So the higher the spectral centroid, so towards the right on this graph is a higher spectral centroid, towards the left is that lower spectral centroid, and then color saturation. So low color saturation with low spectral centroid, high color saturation with high spectral centroid. And then one other example of an experiment. So this was an experiment testing a more automatic level of processing similar to that chimpanzee experiment. So what was found was that when a high spectral centroid was paired with an unsaturated color, so the thing that shouldn't match, people had higher levels of error rates. So towards the right on this little graph here means more errors, and again, significant. And on this part of the graph, when that high centroid was paired with a saturated color, so the thing that did match, they had differences in their response time. So over here, we had more errors when it was unpaired, it was paired the wrong way, and over here, we had a faster response when it was paired the right way, showing that this one even kind of works on an automatic level. Okay, that concludes saturation. Now, this idea of yellowness, there's something special about the color yellow in the literature on cross-modal correspondences. So it was shown as early as 1956, actually with children, that people associate yellow with high pitch and blue with low pitch, but for a really long time, we didn't know if that was because of the color yellow and blue, or if it was just because of the luminance, because yellow, if you desaturate the color, is actually naturally lighter than blue. So Hamilton Fletcher and others set out to test equal luminant colors, which means colors that are exactly the same lightness, no matter what their saturation level. And what they found were some parameters related to saturation, and I've actually just talked about their study in saturation. So desaturation was associated with the lowest pitch, the quietest pitches, the fewest partials, and the lowest spectral centroid, whereas high saturation was associated with the highest pitch and the loudest sounds and the most partials and the highest spectral centroids. We just talked about this. But what they also found was that people still associate high pitch with yellow even when yellow was no lighter than any of the other colors. And they, in their complex tones, that just means tones that had other frequencies in their sound. So some tones have only one frequency in their sound. They have to be made by computers because they don't really exist in nature. But most sounds have multiple frequencies. If you were to analyze them, you'd see multiple frequencies layered on top of each other. Like my voice is made up of tons of frequencies laid on top of each other. Any complex sound that had high energy over this 800 hertz mark was deemed to be yellow, no matter what the pitch was. So 800 hertz was right about there. And this idea of yellowness comes up elsewhere in other studies. So this is a study by Reuter and others that asked people to pair different instrument pitches with colors, and they were kind of everywhere. as far as what like actual hue people chose. It's the thing that seems to be the most subjective, especially when there's no emotional reason to choose any particular color. But you do see, you know, lighter colors for the higher pitches and darker colors for the lower pitches. So that still holds true. But when you look at the most chosen colors for their experiment, they all form this sort of brown through orange to yellow spectrum. And there's even a study on haptic stimuli, so that's, that refers to touch. So people were introduced to different levels and types of touches. And the ones that were the most intense were deemed to be dark brown, whereas the least intense were deemed to be light yellow, close to white. So this yellowness thing keeps popping up in the literature, and you have to wonder, maybe does it have to do something to do with our yellow sun? You know, we live on a planet that revolves around a yellow dwarf star. It's not the only type of light that's out there, the only type of star, but that's what we happen to live on. Maybe, you know, we don't know. But perhaps that's the reason why yellow seems to be such an important color in cross-modal correspondences. It's also interesting that the same things musically that seem to facilitate timbral blending, so when instruments like really blend into each other, like quiet dynamics and low spectral centroid, are also related to desaturated color in these experiments, and desaturated color are the things that help facilitate pigment blending, like paints blending. And a quick lesson from Color Theory by Marco Bucci will explain what I mean.
Now, you might be tempted to think that red's path to green would go like this, just like we saw from yellow to green earlier. But that is just not the case. Near the beginning of this lesson, I pointed out that all colors share this gray area. This becomes relevant when colors live farther away from each other, because that's the route they take. So for red to travel to green, it takes a path that looks more like this. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to go perfectly through gray. You can see in the path there, it does still pass through orange and yellow, just very grayed versions of them.
Okay, so maybe the way that we process musical and sound information has something to do in the brain and cognitively with the way we also deal with information related to colored light in our world. Okay, and finally, the fourth category of this sound color correspondences section, emotionally mediated colors. So this study by Palmer and others set out to test the emotional mediation hypothesis, which basically says that we have emotions while we listen to music, and we choose colors that match those emotions. So this study had a number of different intricate parts, but basically the most important part of it was they asked people to listen to 18 excerpts of different, major, minor, fast, slow, and they asked them to pair them with colors. And the colors that they chose just skipped many slides. Okay, excuse me. The colors that they chose for the major mode fast music were across the board very warm, very bright, and very saturated. Whereas the colors chosen for the slow minor mode music were the more desaturated, so more gray, and cooler, so more blue colors. They also did a number of other checks to make sure it wasn't just correlational. They asked people to separately study or choose which emotions matched the colors, which emotions matched the music. They studied what emotive faces paired with the colors, what emotive faces paired with the music. And this emotional mediation hypothesis was deemed to be correct in this study. And then it was also shown in at least 8 other studies doing the same sorts of things. So finding that slow minor mode music relates to cool and desaturated color, and fast major mode music relates to warmer, brighter, saturated colors. Okay, so to sum up the color correspondences section, emotional mediation is a really strong effect. It's like the first thing to give us cross-modal correspondences when it's present. It affects hue, so which color, red, green, blue, which hue. Lightness, so how light or dark something is, how close to white versus close to black, and saturation, so how vibrant it is. Then register, so that's talking about like low pitch versus high pitch, affects the lightness of the color and this idea of yellowness, with high pitches being more yellow. And then finally, the timbre, which is really related to dynamics, or how loud or soft an instrument is playing, is related to saturation, with things that are both a higher spectral centroid and louder being more saturated, and things that are quieter with a lower centroid being desaturated. And now we're going to be talking about the relation of this science to musical imagery. And to begin this section, I'm going to show you a quote from a documentary by Simon Rattle, in which he talks about a very particular point in time in which composers began to really focus on timbre, or this word that we use to describe sound color, as opposed to the role given to melody and harmony. Melody and harmony is still important, but it's now, timbre is allowed to take a more front seat in musical composition. And the piece that everyone describes as a particular turning point in this is Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, which we're not actually going to be talking about, but that is the piece he's discussing in this excerpt.
The horns, which were so much a part of the German fixation with hunting and forests, are no longer a blanket which covers. They're somehow a sound which warms and heats and gives us reds and oranges rather than browns. The woodwinds are allowed to do different things. They tend to make shapes which aren't decoration, because in this, decoration becomes substance. The strings become some kind of wash of background, rather like in a watercolor. Very detailed, but not always clear to the ear or eye.
Okay, so, one of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot in my research is whether this type of language and description about music is just poetic, or, one thing seems to correlate with another. I think that there's something to be found in the idea that we maybe represent both color and sound in some similar way in the brain, or the cognitive system seems to deal with information from sound in some similar way to music. There are pairings that, facilitate our performances on tasks like we've seen in these experiments. And so what he's talking about, when composers write in a particular new way that allows timbre to be more forefront, we start to see colors in our mind's eye. Maybe that's not such an arbitrary thing to say. Maybe that's more real. Maybe what the brain is dealing with as information when we're listening to music that forefronts timbre, maybe is allowing our brain to start to imagine colors in a more neurological way. So we're going to be talking about how imagery, in our case today, paintings, can do more than just inspire composers, but it can actually be coded into the music and transmitted to the listener. And we'll be talking about Debussy and Kaija Saariaho. So, Nuage from Nocturnes for Orchestra. Debussy says about this movement that nuage renders the immutable aspect of the sky and the slow, solemn motion of the clouds fading away in gray tones, slightly tinged with white. He also reportedly told a friend that it represents night on the Pont de Solferino, very late, a great stillness. I was leaning on the railing of the bridge, the Seine without a ripple, like a tarnished mirror. Some clouds slowly passed through a moonless sky. So in the first quote, which is part of what he wrote about the piece, we have the gray tones lightly tinged with white. In the second quote, just spoken to a friend, we have this more dark blue night river scene sort of thing. And we're going to look at how, based on what the science says, the colors that should be evoked by this excerpt are the colors that inspired the piece. So there's anecdotal evidence that Whistler's nocturnes, the paintings, may have played a role in inspiring this piece. We don't know for sure if that's true, but we do know that they knew about each other, Whistler and Debussy, and they both knew about each other's collection called Nocturnes. So it's we don't know more than that, whether it's actually the inspiration of the piece. And the cross-modal correspondences that I would like you to listen for are these cool desaturated colors that come by two ways. One of them is emotional mediation. So this is that kind of simple idea that slow minor mode music pairs with desaturated, cooler or bluer colors. But he doubly reinforces those through timbre. So he uses lowered spectral centroid, or those darker colors in terms of timbre, in order to also allude to those grays and blues, and also the quiet dynamic. So what he does, the winds, like the clarinets and the bassoons are playing pianissimo in a dark part of their range. Things like trumpets and oboes are not even used in this movement. He omits them. It's a piece for full orchestra, but you'll notice that only a few of the instruments of the orchestra are being used in this movement, very particular ones. And there is an English horn melody. So English horn is the lower of the oboe family. It's darker already than an oboe, but it's the brightest of the bunch. But it is the solo. So this one kind of bright instrument has been reserved for the solo. So it's foregrounded in kind of a color way, the way like a warmer color, a more saturated color might be foregrounded in a painting. It would draw our eye. So it draws our ear in like a visual way. And the strings have been divided into 14 parts, and they're all using mutes, which are little devices that are put on the strings that change their timbre, and it takes away some of their high spectral energy and lowers the spectral centroid. That's what mutes do. And then the quiet dynamic, of course, relates to this desaturated color. So let's take a listen. All right, do you hear those sorts of soft gray clouds coming in? Now, in contrast, this other movement of nocturnes called fête is very different. It's the polar opposite. And he says about the movement, Debussy says, that fête gives us the vibrating atmosphere with sudden flashes of light. There is also the episode of the procession, a dazzling, fantastic vision, which passes through the festive scene and becomes merged with it. So he's talking about bright flashes and festivity. And so now let's listen. We will hear this immediate, like fast, bright major mode, but listen what happens with the timbre. It's not just the major fast mode. Okay, so we have the mutes are gone from the strings. They're playing in relations that reinforce each other's harmonic series. So they have things like octave relations, fifths relations, which were gone in the nuage movement. But we also have the trumpets are here, and the oboes are here. And so these bright, spectrally centroid, high spectral centroid instruments are present. So he's, again, doubly reinforced the color ideas from the emotional mediation through timbre, which I think is how this piece is so effective visually. So we've talked about the warm, saturated colors from emotional mediation. Whenever I use that phrase, emotional mediation, we're talking about major mode, fast music is warm and saturated. Minor mode, slow music is cool and desaturated. And then, yes, we have the higher spectral centroid, the oboe, and the trumpet, and then we have the loud dynamic too. Okay, now we're going to be talking about Kaija Saariaho's piece, Freeze, for violin and electronics. And this piece was inspired by paintings by Odilon Redon. And I will be talking about two of the movements, Frise jaune, or yellow frieze, and Frise grise, gray frieze. So Frise jaune is really characterized by a lot of high spectral energy, high pitch, but not just pitch, high energy. So the violin is playing a lot with a couple of different techniques. Sul ponticello, is anybody in here a string instrumentalist? Okay, actually nobody. All right, but playing sul ponticello means in a place on the instrument that produces higher spectral energy than other places. You can actually bow in different locations to produce different amounts of spectral energy. And the electronics are infused with these high sparkling pitches. And finally, harmonics are used in such a way that they add this sparkling high pitch to the piece. And we have a lack of emotional mediation. So we don't have a clear major or minor mode. We don't even have a clear tempo. So what that means is that super strong emotional mediation effect can take a backseat. It's not present, which means since we're full of high stuff, high energy, that yellowness effect can come into play. So let's take a listen. All right. And then, in contrast, Frise grise, the fourth movement, we do have emotional mediation because we're in a very slow tempo in a quasi-minor mode. And we also have that, again, doubly reinforced through timbre, through lowered spectral centroid. So the electronics are actually a recording of a violin lowered many octaves down. So that makes the sound darker already. And in addition, it's playing in parallel motion with the violin, but not in an octave relationship, and something a little bit off from that. So it doesn't allow the reinforcement that we would get from the harmonic series to come into play. It's kept kind of dull. Okay, do you hear the difference between the two? Yeah. So these have been two examples. With Debussy, we have his own words about the piece and then the maybe connection to Whistler's paintings. And with Saariaho, she just comes out and says that she was inspired by these paintings when she wrote the music. So we have kind of the proof. And then we can see through the music that it actually accords with what the science says about what those kinds of sounds should evoke. So now we're going to be moving on to the wonderful world of taste and smell correspondences, which is a newer area of cross-modal research. And we have a piece that was inspired by taste and smells. So Will Stackpole is a friend of mine. He wrote this string trio called Palette, and he writes about the piece. Many times when I'm trying to describe a flavor or a scent, I often find myself doing so in terms of timbre, frequency response, or reverberance. In this set of miniatures, I wanted to explore ways that timbre can develop over time, and I therefore used some of my favorite flavors and olfactory experiences as a source of inspiration for each piece. In no particular order, these were coffee, lemon, salt, jalapeno, gin martinis, and oysters. And a couple of interesting things about his composition process. So he says he did away with any kind of preconceived like music theory tricks or any system, and he just actually got real live samples of those tastes and smells, and he says he kind of meditated on them and then intuitively wrote the music that seemed to match. So this is actually a perfect example of the things we're talking about, because it's someone who just relied on intuition, got rid of any kind of other like system that could have come into play, and just intuited what the music should sound like. And he said he kind of set up like a scratch and sniff session, and he was like tasting things. He also said, I hope he doesn't mind me sharing, that when he got to the gin martini, that he couldn't, sample the sample too many times or the work would suffer a bit. So we're going to be talking about some of these today, but first I'm going to play a little clip from this researcher named Charles Spence, who's one of the big names in cross-modal correspondences. And if you're curious about this topic and you want a place to start, he has some really great review articles that just talk about the state of the research. Here's what's been done, here's what's been shown. He has one from 2011, and I think one from 2019, one from 2020. So if you want to go check this out on your own, that's a good place to start. He's done a lot of work with food lately. So here's a little clip.
I've found that one of the best places to study multisensory interaction is food. Diners and restaurateurs are always surprised to learn that higher pitched music will bring out the sweetness in a dish, whereas playing lower pitched, more brassy sounds will accentuate the bitter notes instead.
Okay, so he's talking about work that's been done that actually shows, like in a significant way again, the science shows that our taste perception can be altered by the pitch of the music playing in the background. So, for example, if you're eating like a chocolate, I believe there's at least one study done with chocolate that people will actually taste the chocolate as sweeter if the music playing while they're eating it is higher. And they'll taste it as more bitter if the music is lower, even if it's the same chocolate. But we're actually going to be talking about when people are introduced to flavors or scents and they're just asked to match them to a sound. So he's done work with other collaborators like Kriznell, showing the pitches of different tastes and different smells. So things that are sweeter and more acidic seem to be higher in pitch. So earlier when we had that little quiz and we all thought the lemon was the high pitch, right? So lemon is one of those flavors that's been deemed to be high in pitch, just for everyone, at least for a majority of the general population. And the same thing goes for the smells. So the things like the fruity smells, the sweeter, fruitier smells are higher in pitch than the more, like the smoke, musk, dark chocolate, cut hay, cedar. This feels intuitively right? These sorts of, the smokier scents are lower in pitch. Things like coffee are much lower in pitch than things like sugar. Okay, so there's a lot of studies out there, and I'll summarize them. Part of the reason that there are so many studies is that the food and beverage and restaurant industries seem to have been willing to put a lot of funding into knowing how to get people to spend more money at their restaurants and on their food, because we really love when things cross-modally match. We've kind of touched on this, and we're going to talk about it more in a little bit. We love when things cross-modally match. So anyway, sweet tastes are associated with sounds that are high, pure, or that lower spectral centroid, smooth, and continuous. Sour tastes are also high, but they're also bright, so maybe their centroid is a little higher. Spicy tastes are pretty high. Maybe they're not as high as sweet or sour tastes, but they're definitely bright, and they're also rough, bright and rough. Salty tastes are specifically disconnected, so musical things like staccato and interspersed with rest, so that's a salty sound. And bitter tastes are lower than anything else on the screen, low in pitch, bright, rough, and brassy. Okay, so we'll listen to 4 brief excerpts of these movements, and I want you to just see if you can guess. So in no particular order, these are the things you're looking for: the coffee, lemon, jalapeno, and salt. And see if you can remember your answers, and I will just put them up at the end. So here's number 1. Okay, number 2. All right, number 3. And number 4. Okay, do you have your answers in mind? Okay, let's see how you did. All right. Did anybody get all 4? All right. Okay, for anybody watching at home, that was most people. Well, I know I just told you the science, so like they were a little bit primed, but great, yeah. And Will was actually quite surprised to learn that the things that he associated with the different tastes were actually shared, and that they weren't just personal. And actually, the way he presents this piece, he kind of like keeps it a secret. And he even says that, I know these things are more interesting to me than to you, or like they're more personal. But yeah, he was actually kind of surprised to learn that they're actually, science says they're more shared than you think. Okay, so now finally in this section of the talk, we'll finish by talking about temperature correspondences, in particular cold. And I have this piece called flow edge. Flow edge is the term used to describe the line where fixed continental ice becomes free-floating ice. And so the science says that the things that should correspond to cold temperature, again summarized from these sources, are high pitch, fast tempo, or at least a kind of internally moving tempo, senza vibrato, no vibrato, which means instead of not this, but this, okay, that's senza vibrato, and a thin metallic timbre. So let's see, can you hear any of these things in this piece? All right, so I think, yeah, there's this kind of internally fast-moving notes you see in the piano. There's harmonics being played in the strings, senza vibrato, and very high, and then that metallic timbre comes from those and from the triangle, and then a bowed cymbal. So he's taking a string bow and bowing the edge of a big cymbal to produce those interesting, high, sparkling, harsh sounds. Okay, so this concludes the section where I'm going to be talking about the sciences behind cross-modal correspondences as far as what pairs with what. And now we're going to be talking about the applications of these things, but we have a little bit more science to cover. We're going to be discussing this idea of cross-modal concerts of the future, or what if we kind of plugged in our knowledge about these things to make, especially contemporary music, which can be a bit alienating for a lot of people, more intuitively understandable. First, this idea that the brain loves things that cross-modally match. We've kind of touched on this a couple times throughout this talk. So we're gonna do a quick little activity, okay? Everybody get ready to speak again, okay? So I want you to say the name of the color that the word is printed in, okay? The name of the color that the word is printed in. Does that make sense? Ready? As fast as you can. As fast as you can. Ready? Okay, so that was pretty easy, right? Everybody did it very quickly and very easily. Now, level 2, same task. I want you to say the color that the word is printed in as fast as you can. You ready? Okay, that was a bit harder, right? Okay, so you've just, some of you have probably seen this before. This is called the Stroop effect. So this is a famous effect that shows that we process words much more quickly when they're in the color that they describe. So this is a really specific example, of course, because the word basically equals the color, but this same sort of effect has been shown to be at play in parameters that are more abstract, like sound and color. We've actually talked a little bit about studies that deal with this sort of Stroop type interference. So the chimpanzee experiment was similar to this. The study showing that when a high saturated color was paired with a high spectral centroid, people performed quicker on a task. This is the same sort of thing we're talking about. And there's also even been a study that shows preference comes into play when things cross-modally match. So there was a study where made-up faces were paired with made-up names, and then people just had to decide which ones they liked. So the results showed that people liked names that sounded like their faces looked. So, for example, this guy on the left, we have a nice Disney villain-looking guy here, very pointy, and he has a very round name, Bob Gorbo, and this was not preferred. Whereas this guy with a round face and a nice round name to match was preferred. And this effect, they even found a real-world example in this study. So they looked at real people, people who had run for U.S. Senate during a period of time. And then they ran a separate study to determine scientifically who matched their faces really well and who matched their faces really poorly. They got rid of anyone who was kind of ambiguous. So they took just the people who matched extremely well or the people who matched their names extremely poorly. Of those people, the ones who matched their names extremely well got about 10% more votes in these elections than the people who matched their names really poorly, which is it's a fascinating thing to think about and a bit disturbing, right? And it just makes you think a little bit. It just makes you think. Okay. All right, so we're talking about this idea of fluency. Fluency is the ease with which information flows through the cognitive system. And it's what we call effectively positive. So high fluency, when things are flowing easily and quickly through the cognitive system, it makes us feel good. It makes us feel like happier. So there's even fluency theories of aesthetic appraisal, which is just a way of saying that the artworks that we prefer, the things that we think are artistically beautiful, are simply the things we understand the best, even though they were complex. So not just the understanding, but understanding things that were complex. These are the artworks we think are the most beautiful. That's a theory. Whether or not it's actually true, up for debate. But this is also related to this idea that understanding something simple and familiar, that's all right, it's mildly pleasant. But understanding something complex and unfamiliar, but you still understand it, is exhilarating. So then when an artwork is very complex, very unfamiliar, yet the ease of understanding is very high, this is when we have the most aesthetic pleasure. This is what the theory states. And so things like contemporary classical music would often fall into that high complexity zone. So if we can use this knowledge about cross-modal correspondences, we like when things match and it helps us understand them more quickly and more easily, then maybe something as sometimes alienating or distancing as contemporary classical music, especially to a general audience, could be less so and more intuitively understood. And that brings us to this project that I worked on a few years ago called Symphony XR. And the XR stands for Extended Reality. So this was a project that we did around my piece To Starboard, Starbound, which you'll hear in a few minutes. And it was to create visuals to go with the music. And Clara was actually my collaborator on this project, in addition to researchers at Drexel and game design students, and people at the Gerdes Institute and Microsoft HoloLens lent us some headsets. So this piece was conceived cinematically, more so than any of my other pieces, which are all basically cross-modal in some way. There's really nothing that's not. But this piece was conceived in a way that it had scenes, and it even had camera angles that I was trying to code into the music, the camera's aimed down at this, and then it pans upward at this other color, and spaces. So, for example, one of the scenes, you're underwater. We'll see if you can guess which one it is after you listen. You're underwater in a dark place, and gradually you rise up and up and up, and it becomes brighter and brighter. Another scene, there's this volcanic activity, and first it begins kind of looking at the rocky ground, and then pans up to the bright reds and oranges, and the climax of the piece, kind of in the middle, is I tried to create, through sound, this space that felt huge, so this big black space that through which was piercing this bright yellow light. So I did this in a way that it actually kind of accords well with the science. I won't take the time to talk about the details of how. I want you to kind of see if you can hear the different scenes and just see what you feel when you're listening. So this project, the original Symphony XR, like I said, was done with video game designers at Drexel in Philadelphia and the Gerdes Institute, which is where this performance is taking place. So audience members wore the Microsoft HoloLens headsets, and this is an example of what they saw through it. So there were holograms that were designed for the space, and they were timed by the MIDI information coming from the organ. And so during the underwater scene, they had rendered these fish that swam around the hall, and they knew where the walls were, so when they found a wall, they would turn and swim back. And then there was a volcano that came out of the ground. And so the project was it was a bit low poly, as they say. It was a bit basic. It's a prototype, but we think it's the first of its kind, we think. And the audience members, the important thing about this, it was a live performance, so they were able to see the performer through their clear headsets, and the headsets projected the holograms into their eyes, but it made it look like it was happening in the hall. So it would be pretty cool to have this as a sort of thing as the technology develops, something that we can incorporate into things like orchestral concerts or other types of musical experiences where you could have holograms that accompany the performance, and those holograms could be tuned to the way that people are known to cross-modally think. So they could be actually designed to match. And so, to summarize what we've talked about today, we talked about the science of cross-modal correspondences and musical examples, their role in composition, composers past and present. And we've talked about their role in cognitive processing, how they increase fluency or the ease with which information flows through our cognitive system. And finally, We've talked about audience applications, so the potential for cross-modal concerts of the future. And we're going to finish today by hearing this piece live with no visuals. But I would like you to see, you can close your eyes or leave them open, see if you can come up with what you cross-modally feel. So this could be temperature, it could be light, brightness, darkness. What kind of space do you feel like you're in? Is it a large space? Is it open? What kind of hues and saturations do you see? These sorts of things. Textures. So just see if you can like really tune into your own cross-modal connections. They are likely there, even if you've never kind of paid attention to them. But I think if we give them attention, that you'll be able to see and feel these things in your mind's eye more than maybe you otherwise would. So I would like to welcome to the stage Clara Gerdes, who is my colleague on the Symphony XR project, and she is going to play for you to Starboard, Starbound. Thank you so much, Clara. That was a beautiful performance. So we are going to be able to ask questions from the audience as well as online. Okay, so those of you who are watching online, feel free to put your questions into the chat and we will answer them here.
We can start off with one online question.
Sure.
All right. This is from Ida, and she says, I am wondering if this phenomenon is similar in people who are unable to see due to a congenital issue from birth or conversely due to an accident or age later in life. And if they hear different sounds than you've showed throughout your talk, do you think that they would be able to describe the feelings the same way? Would they relate to it more to taste? So she asked this question before you got to taste.
Okay, all right, so the question is, would these same sorts of effects hold in people who are congenitally blind or who lost their vision? And would they picture in the mind's eye, so to speak, the same sorts of things, or would they relate them to maybe other senses? So I do know of at least one study showing that pitch height, I didn't really talk about this correspondence, but like the idea that sounds that are higher on the keyboard are higher in space actually holds in the congenitally blind community. They've studied this. As far as the color ones, I don't know. I don't know of studies. Like my intuition would say that for those who are congenitally blind, that it may attach to other senses, but the same processes may be at play. But that's just a guess. Yes, Stephen?
So you have this thing where you have different tastes go with different pitches, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You have coffee on the bottom, low pitches, and sugar on the top, high pitches. So what happens when you put sugar in your coffee?
Oh, in theory. Okay, so the question is, or the statement, like, if sugar is high in pitch and coffee is low in pitch, what happens when you combine them and put sugar in your coffee? I think it would raise the pitch. I mean, if these things are, if it would be like a sweeter coffee, right? So in theory, different flavors of coffee would fall on slightly different pitches, the more bitter being more low and sweeter being more high. So I think like a Tim Hortons double-double is probably higher in pitch than like a really robust black coffee. That would be my guess. I'm also, while we're talking, going to put up my contact info in case anyone has questions later, or if you want to keep tabs on my research, when I'm writing my dissertation, if you want to keep tabs on the things that I'm looking at, please feel free to sign up for my newsletter or just ask me questions. I'd be happy to sort of share this beyond this talk. Do we have any other questions? Oh, yes, Bob? Sure.
This is a little bit like Stephen's, which made me think of this, but do you have paradoxical combinations sometimes where, for example, a very bright timbre goes with a very dark harmony, or a bright harmony goes with very dark timbres? What do you think happens when you have that kind of collision of maybe things with opposite meanings?
Right, yeah, okay, so the question, for those listening at home, what happens when the cross-modal correspondences contradict each other? So when we have a very dark harmony with a very bright timbre, and what would that lead to? So, okay, well, I'll answer this as a synesthete first. So I guess I didn't mention this, but so does anyone have synesthesia here in the audience? Or put it in the chat? Okay, a couple, yeah. So there have been studies that show that synesthetes, in addition to whatever their own synesthesia might lead to, they have stronger cross-modal correspondences. So these things are really hypercharged for us. So for me, when things contradict, sometimes it cancels out. So these things are actually kind of fragile. So like if you wanted to, like for me, the Saariaho piece, the yellow frieze is so bright yellow. It's so high, and all the timbres like reinforce it. The Debussy is so gray and bluish, but it's like a rare occurrence that it all like synergistically comes together like this. So I think most of the time they're contradicting each other. And in order to bring them out with the most strength, like I try to use, when I'm really trying to darken things, I will use the dark timbre and the dark harmony and the low pitch and, anything I can to kind of layer it on top of each other. But you could also kind of get like interesting mixes, as long as, it's kind of like if you have a palette of paint, there would be a way to paint from all different colors on your palette to just like one big brown black mass. There's a way to do that, but I think there's a way to paint with like more than one color that allows the colors to still like maintain their characteristics. So I guess, and as far as like what the science says about contradictions, I don't know if there's, most of the studies that we have are with such simple stimuli that it hasn't really been studied. But they do have, the ones that have more relation to like more complex stimuli, I know that there are some in trying to influence taste, well, they'll make like a soundtrack. So things that are high in pitch and major mode will influence that sweet taste. So those two things work together. So if it were like high in pitch and minor mode, would it? Maybe not. So maybe that answers your question, maybe not, I'm sure. And Clara?
I know in Baroque music there's this thing called the doctrine of the affections.
Oh, yes.
Different keys have like different sort of emotional significance. But that's not so much related to like timbre and pitch and things like that as it is the actual key, which I wonder if like that maybe was coming from the same sort of place intuitively for those people, or maybe from somewhere different.
Right, okay, so the question is the Baroque idea of the doctrine of the affections, where different keys have different emotional qualities. And so in these sort of non-equal tempered systems, different, like the key of C sharp sounded very, very different than the key of D. This sounds basically like it's the same. I don't have perfect pitch. So on our equal tempered instruments, like all the distances are kept like mathematically the same. But that wasn't always the case in certain tuning systems. So I don't know. That's an area of research that I think I'd be interested in looking into. I don't have much prior to the turn of the 20th century, but I'm really curious. So that would be one thing that needs to, I think, be looked into. Like, do those things have anything to do with like cross-modal correspondences? And then also, like way back, Hildegard von Bingen, who is like a hero of mine. So she saw visions in her mind's eye, or maybe like outside of her mind's eye. And I'm also interested in looking at her her visual descriptions, and do they relate through the science to her music at all? That's another avenue. And lots of other things, like Anthony Braxton is another area that I'm looking to get into through synesthesia. So there's lots of avenues. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you all so much for coming and for supporting this talk. And yeah, again, if you have any other like thoughts later, feel free to email me. I would be happy to chat about this more. So, thank you.